Hello and welcome to the program today. I'm Anne Nwawadu. We begin with a meeting with President Xi Jinping of China and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin at the Kremlin on his arrival in Moscow, talking about subjects including bilateral ties and the Ukraine crisis. Mr. Xi noted that it was pleased to pay another state a visit to Russia at the invitation of Mr. Putin, adding that Russia was the first country he visited after he was elected president 10 years ago, and memories from that visit remain very fresh till today. Mr. Putin extended a warm welcome to Mr. Xi for his state visit to Russia and once again warmly congratulated him on his re-election as Chinese president. The Chinese president stressed that voices for peace and rationality have been building on the Ukraine issue, adding that a review of history shows that conflicts in the end have to be settled through dialogue and negotiation. China released the documents on its position on the Ukraine crisis, advocating this political settlement of the crisis and rejecting the Cold War mentality and unilateral sanctions. Mr. Putin said that Russia appreciates China for consistently upholding an impartial, objective and balanced position and standing for fairness and justice on major international issues. Meanwhile, Mr. Xi Jinping met with the Russian Prime Minister also, Mikhail Mishustin, today at the second day of a state visit to Russia. He invited the minister to visit China as soon as possible to establish closer ties with China's new Prime Minister, Li Qiang. Mr. Xi's three-day visit to Russia is coming as Beijing attempts to frame itself as a mediator in the conflict in Ukraine, having called for a ceasefire and peace talks in the vaguely worded proposal just last month. In a televised comment, Mr. Putin said Mr. Xi had viewed China's proposals for a resolution of the Ukraine conflict with respect. Mr. Xi, on his own part, praised Mr. Putin and predicted Russians would re-elect him next year. And of course, the White House has been monitoring Mr. Xi's visit as expected and has asked the Chinese president to use his visit to Moscow this week to tell Russian President Vladimir Putin to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and end Russia's war against Ukraine. John Kirby, the White House national security spokesperson, told reporters that the United States is concerned that Mr. Xi, currently on a trip to Moscow, will reiterate calls for a ceasefire that would leave Russian forces inside Ukraine's sovereign territory. Mr. Kirby said Mr. Xi will speak with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky about the impact of the war on Ukraine.
On the same UN, we encouraged President Xi to advocate for this exact essential key point, which must include the withdrawal of Russian forces from sovereign Ukrainian territory consistent with the UN Charter. The entire world would like to see this war end, especially the Ukrainians themselves, who have put forward their own plan for a just peace, which draws again on these same UN principles. We hope that President Xi will press President Putin to cease bombing Ukrainian cities, hospitals, and schools, to halt the war crimes and atrocities, and to withdraw all its troops. But we are concerned that, instead, China will reiterate calls for a ceasefire that leaves Russian forces inside Ukraine's sovereign territory. Now, any ceasefire that does not address the removal of Russian forces from Ukraine would effectively ratify Russia's illegal conquest. Efforts to end this conflict must take Ukraine's position into account. And so we encourage President Xi to play a constructive role by speaking with President Zelensky, which he has not done since Russia launched this invasion. Because China, quite frankly, we believe, should hear directly from the Ukrainians and not just from the Russians. And we encourage President Xi to press President Putin directly on the need to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The world and China's neighbors will certainly be watching closely. You've heard the president say this himself. He wants to have another conversation with President Xi, and he'll do that. And we'll do that at the most appropriate time. I don't have a call on the schedule to speak to, but it's important that we keep those lines of communication open, particularly now when tensions are so high. That's why we still want to get Secretary Blinken back to Beijing. That visit was postponed. It wasn't canceled. And we're still hopeful that we can get that back on the calendar. As a matter of fact, we're having discussions with the PRC right now about potential visit by Secretary Yellen and Secretary Raimondo to go over there and talk about economic issues. So there's that we're still working. So all of that, keeping those lines of communication open, are still valuable. We don't know if there's going to be some sort of arrangement. I would just tell you that we still don't believe that China's taken it off the table. We still don't believe and haven't seen any indication that they're moving in that direction, or they've made a decision to provide, or that they're actually going to do that. We continue to believe it's not in China's best interest to do that, to help Mr. Putin slaughter innocent Ukrainians. It's hard to believe that they would think that that's in their best interest. It would also run counter to what we've heard President Xi talk about in terms of what his ultimate goal here is. I think he put an op-ed out today talking about sovereignty, territorial integrity, finding a peaceful way to end this war. That providing lethal weapons would seem to be inconsistent with that goal. So I hope he got to see what his troops, his military, and his war did to that city. But we'll let him speak to what he came away from. I would also tell you that it's clear that he knows, he has to know how badly he's doing inside Ukraine. I mean, more than 50% of the territory they took from Ukraine in the first weeks and months of the war, the Ukrainians have already taken back. And the only real active fighting right now is around Bakhmut. And here we are on, what is it today, the 20th? And Bakhmut is still not in Russian hands. Now, they're fighting over it, but the Ukrainians aren't giving up on it.
Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken denounced Chinese leader Xi Jinping's visit to Russia, saying that timing showed that Beijing was providing Moscow with diplomatic cover to commit further crimes. It was the first trip abroad for Mr. Xi since he obtained an unprecedented third term last month. The Chinese leader had been trying to portray Beijing as a potential peacemaker in Ukraine, even as it deepens economic ties with his closest ally, Russia.
If China is committed to supporting an end to the war, based on the principles of the UN Charter, as called for in point 1 of its plan, it can engage with President Zelensky and Ukraine on that basis and use its influence to compel Moscow to pull back its forces. Russia's purported annexation of sovereign Ukrainian territory, including vast areas it doesn't even control, and its ongoing brutal attacks on civilians make clear that President Putin currently has no interest in such a peace. That President Xi is traveling to Russia days after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for President Putin suggests that China feels no responsibility to hold the Kremlin accountable for the atrocities committed in Ukraine, and instead of even condemning them, it would rather provide diplomatic cover for Russia to continue to commit those very crimes. Calling for a ceasefire that does not include the removal of Russian forces from Ukrainian territory would effectively be supporting the ratification of Russian conquest. It would recognize Russia's attempts to seize the sovereign neighbor's territory by force. It would enable Russia to further entrench positions in Ukraine, and a ceasefire now, without a durable solution, would allow President Putin to rest and refit his troops, and then restart the war at a time more advantageous to Russia. The world should not be fooled by any tactical move by Russia, supported by China or any other country, to freeze the war on its own terms. Such a move would violate the UN Charter and defy the will of 141 countries who have condemned Russia's war in the United Nations General Assembly.
Let's bring in international affairs analyst Yenichi, who joins us virtually from East Midlands in the United Kingdom. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Yenichi, and good to see you. So what do you make of China's president's visit to Moscow? Let's begin with that first.
Well, so when I saw that, I just thought, okay, it's emerging from the shadows. All right, the Chinese president had business to take care of back home, which is re-election. And once he was able to consolidate his hold back home, he came out. And I think that for the first time, we can see that Russia is doing all of this, not just by its own might, but because somewhere behind the scenes enjoys patronage of the Chinese government. So it's an auspicious moment for China and the Chinese president to attempt this visit and indeed to be there. And then also it speaks volumes to what has been happening in recent times. So this visit is not a coincidence. It was well orchestrated, well planned. And then I beg to say that the Russian president will believe now that he has been able to justify his invasion of Ukraine. And then I'm sure that behind the scenes, the Chinese president will be saying well done to Putin for being able to sustain the war this far. And then, of course, China takes it over from here.
Okay, so while China is trying to strengthen ties with its closest ally, China, on the other hand, proposed a 12-point plan for peace in Ukraine. Do you think China is in a good position to actually broker peace between Russia and Ukraine?
I think there's just an absence of sincerity. It's criminality in disguise and nothing more than that. So you ask yourself, in the last 2-3 weeks, very minimum, China has been going at United States of America, okay? So the first thing that we saw was that China sent balloons, spy balloons, into the skies in the United States. And it took President Biden a few weeks to make a decision, but eventually those 3 balloons were shot down. Spy balloons were, for the matter of fact, were surveillance balloons. And then, of course, last week, China again shot down a US drone, okay, from the skies very near Ukraine by the Baltic Sea. And then just yesterday, Chinese jets and with the support of Russia also escorted a United States warplane from the skies in Ukraine. So it lies ill in the mouth of the president of China to be talking about peace today, because even the president of China and the Chinese government has not shown any respect for international treaties. Acts of aggression have been going back and forth between China and the United States in the past 3 weeks or more than that. There is no pedestal, there is no standpoint for China today to come and act as a mediator. If anything, China overtly claims to want to broker peace, but covertly supports Russia in what it is doing. And I said it before on this program, China is merely supporting Russia on a test run because we need to watch out for Taiwan. Okay, China still has Taiwan in its sights. So the Chinese government has no impetus whatsoever. It's got no international backing. It has no instrument of force or treaty to say that it's going to broker peace. It's not China that's going to do this. China may observe, China may give some kind of advice or some position, but nobody in the world is going to listen to China at this time regarding Russia pulling out of Ukraine.
Well, that 12-point plan also calls for the protection of civilians and for Russia and Ukraine to reach a certain level where they will respect each other's sovereignty. Do you see that playing out on the long run?
So the question is, who defines who civilians are? Who do we call civilians? Because as of last week, there was a new law by Russia, all right, releasing female prisoners to fight in the war. That's gender-based violence at the very minimum. What's the definition of civilians? Do we call the Wagner troops that have been reinforcing Russia's strength, do we call them civilians as well? Because they are not enlisted in Russian military? What is the definition of civilians and who defines who civilians are? The civilians are the soft targets here. The only condition, and the United States has reinstated it, the only condition that makes sense at this point is for a total withdrawal by Russia. And that includes what it calls those territories where it has annexed or purportedly annexed, those territories where it has purportedly conducted elections and annexed as part of Russia. Those have to be reversed. And we should not forget the fact that even if Russia ceases fire today, there's still a pending warrant against Mr. Putin by the International Criminal Court, all right? That is not going to go away by just statements. That's not going to be part of the condition for a ceasefire. Mr. Putin will still have to answer to the war crimes that have been perpetrated in Ukraine. And if there are any civilians to be protected here, they are the vulnerable people of Ukraine who never asked to be born in the first place.
So on the other side of all the drama and the crisis between Ukraine and Russia, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is heading to Kiev for an unexpected meeting with the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, to, according to him, resolutely reject Russia's invasion against Ukraine. But do you think this surprise trip is as a result of the Chinese leaders meeting with President Putin in Moscow?
The truth of the matter, there's no surprise here. There's hardly any surprise. Like I said, we've got Taiwan to protect. The United States has economic interests to protect. Just earlier today, I read that the Minister of Trade for the United Kingdom, Kemi Badenoch, had also entered into some new business with Ukraine with respect to technology, digital technology, and a lot of, I think about £148 billion worth of business with Ukraine. Ukraine, on the other hand, has also supported Nigeria with respect to grains and all of that. So what is happening? It is a reordering of power systems in the world as we know it today. Now, the Japanese president goes to Ukraine to protect its own interests, where Biden cannot go. Whenever you see Japan, it is the United States that is active. All right, so Japan will protect the interest of the West as of this time and also try to consolidate its own presence in Asia. And it's a lesson for the rest of the world because as of this moment, the interests of the United States have been protected. The interest of Germany has been protected with respect to military support that is given to Ukraine. The interest of Poland is being protected because it continues to support the United States military drills there in that region of the world. In fact, Iran is also taking a bold step. Iran, Russia, and China are conducting war drills, whereas South Korea is also aligning with the United States conducting military drills there. So any country of the world that knows its onions with respect to foreign policies should step out now and protect its own interest, whether it be military, the economy, it be even rebuilding. There's a lot of money to be made. There's a lot of prominence that is out there to be achieved in rebuilding Ukraine. And that's exactly what Japan is doing.
And talking about the United States and NATO, they have said that Beijing's efforts to mediate are not credible as it has refrained from condemning Russia's invasion in Ukraine. Do you think that China is sitting on the fence in this conflict? Is there any hypocrisy at all in all of this happening?
Well, I don't even call it hypocrisy because it's well planned, well orchestrated. China is by no means sitting on the fence. China is not sitting on the fence. I said it, China is covertly and overtly showing not only its tacit support for Russia and the Russian president, but also telling the whole world, okay, the enemy of my friend is my enemy. That's what China is doing. And it makes sense. If China or the Chinese president comes out to say, we are speaking against Russia, then we know there's a problem. They share boundaries. They've got connections over economic and military, okay? Closest ally in the whole world. How then do we expect that China will come out and condemn Russia that is doing the Chinese bidding? China did the same thing with Hong Kong, and here we are. We cannot even rightly determine that Hong Kong is part of China. And then we need to keep our eyes even on China with respect to Taiwan. So these things are crystal clear, okay? It makes a whole world of sense for the Chinese president to visit Russia and to say, I want to broker peace. It doesn't mean any peace at all. It just means that I'm protecting my interest. And I'll still put it down to the enemy of my friend is my enemy. That's what China is doing right now.
All right, thank you very much. International Affairs Analyst Yenichi, thanks for your time on The World Today, as always.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Welcome back. The International Criminal Court, the ICC, had to take action against Russian President Vladimir Putin over alleged war crimes. But the move was a somber one and not a moment for backslapping. Then that's according to the organization's chief prosecutor, Karim Khan. Just last week, the ICC accused Mr. Putin of war crimes of illegally deporting hundreds of children from Ukraine. Moscow rejects the charges, calling the move unacceptable and saying that it had no legal force in Russia, which is not an ICC member. Russia has not concealed a program under which it has brought thousands of children from Ukraine to Russia, but it presents it as a humanitarian campaign to protect orphans and children abandoned in the conflict zone.
It is really a very sad occasion and a very somber occasion that for the first time ever, judges of the International Criminal Court of any court have felt it necessary to issue warrants against a leader and senior state officials from a permanent member of the Security Council that are founders, that have wonderful histories, but also that are supposed to be guardians of the UN Charter.
And this story, of course, has also a flip side, a darker side, which shows that even the president of a country, permanent member of the UN Security Council, could be a war criminal, which shows that this moment is not only historic but tragic as well.
The issuance of an arrest warrant against Putin by pre-trial chamber of the International Criminal Court is nothing else but the unequivocal affirmation that, notwithstanding all the pressure and attempts of disruption of the international justice system, the Office of Prosecutor and the Court stand as guardians of justice and those that allow themselves to commit international crimes will not go unpunished.
On Friday, the ICC issued an arrest warrant for President Putin and his Children's Rights Commissioner over the alleged abduction of hundreds of Ukrainian children taken forcibly from their parents and deported to Russia. So I think we can feel and say that it is a historic moment for the war in Ukraine, and it underlines the vital importance of the ICC and the Office of the Prosecutor as an independent prosecutor of war criminals. And it sends a much stronger and more far-reaching message right around the world to despots and dictators everywhere that they will be brought to justice, that they will be held to account.
Meanwhile, the Kremlin has said that the International Criminal Court's decision to issue an arrest warrant for President Vladimir Putin was a sign of a clear hostility that exists against Russia and against Mr. Putin personally. But the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, told reporters that Russia was reacting calmly and was continuing its work. Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute that underpins the court, meaning that the warrant is no legal force in Russia. However, the move would hamstring Mr. Putin's travel to any of the 123 countries that do recognize the ICC's jurisdiction. Russia has reacted with fury to the ICC's decision to hit Mr. Putin with an arrest warrant, describing it as outrageous and unacceptable. And the EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell has said the hoped for a deal on the joint procurement of ammunition for Ukraine at a meeting of the bloc's foreign and defense ministers in Brussels, warning of problems should ministers fail to agree. Speaking before the meeting, German foreign minister told reporters providing ammunition to Ukraine that was set to become a central pillar in the European nations' policy towards Ukraine. Czech, Danish, Finnish, and Lithuanian foreign ministers also discussed various support for Ukraine at the meeting.
You know that there is a three-track approach to provide ammunition for about 2 billion euros in order for the Ukraine to being able to continue defending themselves. I hope that the ministers will, all of them, engage in a final discussion and agree on a very important decision for this afternoon. Otherwise, we will be in difficulties in order to continue supplying arms to Ukraine.
I don't think that this can lead to another kind of escalation. If you see at the level of brutality, rocket attacks which Russia perpetrates against the energy infrastructure, complete city razed, destroys, child kidnapped and forcibly being Russified, how more can this escalate? Okay.
And it's not a secret that we want to donate our Pirenia to Ukraine, but it is not up to us to take that decision. We need approval from Switzerland. So that's what we are continuing discussing with Switzerland alongside with our allies in Europe.
We have to maintain firm support to Ukraine until there is a peaceful solution from so where Ukraine could be so strong at the negotiation table as possible. And I appeal to each and everyone that we should continue strongly our support to Ukraine.
Well, visiting a war criminal is, brings a different light to the whole visit, and I think that my guess is that President Xi he feels that he was deceived by the agreement that signed just before the war. He was deceived about the war, and now he understands that he's being dragged in to the situation even without his with a lot of his room for his say. That's not the ideal situation for him.
Britain's Justice Minister Dominic Raab said the countries were providing the International Criminal Court, the ICC, with a wide range of support to uncover crimes in Ukraine. And asked about China's stance on the ICC's move, Mr. Raab said the Chinese leader Xi Jinping could apply diplomatic pressure on Russia to follow international law, whether that happened privately or publicly.
We raised over £4 million in additional contributions and a whole range of non-financial technical support for the work of the ICC, from disaster victim identification experts, the Danish have offered, through to forensic experts from our Dutch friends and the Belgians and the Czechs. The list of support that we provided, investigative support, but also support with witnesses.
Well, I think the most important thing is that this will help Ukrainians to achieve justice, because we know that there's a war going on right now, and every day, if we would wait for gathering the evidence, we would lose important proof and evidence. So there is no time to lose. I think that our colleague from Ireland said we have to act now, and there is no time to waste. And that is also what Ukrainians want from us, and I think they are very right to ask that also from us.
And I think it's certainly true to say that for President Zelensky, the overriding crime above all others has been the invasion and the question of aggression, and we want to try and deal with that and support him as best we can. But I think the one thing that China, as a member of the permanent member of the Security Council, a leading member of the international community, can and should do is say that the cardinal rules of international law, including the right not to have your country invaded unlawfully, ought to be adhered to. And I think the extent to which he can, whether it's privately or publicly, apply diplomatic pressure and leverage to that effect, to that extent, would be welcome.